The wine still carried the warmth of their master's breath as the slaves for the first time raised crystal goblets to their lips in the grand halls of Roman villas, where marble columns captured torchlight like lightning frozen in time. The masters knelt before their slaves, offering platters of honeyed dates and roasted peacock, the silk of their togas, brushing against cold stone as they bowed their heads in submission. These were the delicacies once forbidden, now offered freely. Yet watch the hands the slaves' fingers trembled with a careful precision, as if holding fire. Calloused palms, scarred from years of hauling amphora, now grasped vessels worth more than their bodies ever fetched at auction. The goblets shook not from the December chill, but from the learned fear of punishment of handling something beautiful. Laughter came in measured bursts like water from the faucet, set to flow only when commanded. When masters ordered their slaves to speak freely to mock their betters, their words were veiled in apologies, even their rebellion seeking permission. Their voices cracked under the strain of unfamiliar authority threats disguised as suggestions, anger framed as entertainment. There was a script to their freedom, though no one dared to speak the lines aloud. Saturnalia had arrived. For 7 days, Rome's most valuable property would experience what it felt like to be human, not livestock. It was Rome's gift to its slaves, a fleeting taste of humanity, a brief respite from being bought and sold. But even in this moment of orchestrated joy, something darker stirred in the shifting candlelight. The trembling never ceased. Wine spilled not from carelessness, but because the slaves had forgotten how to hold luxury without fear. And in the silence between commands to celebrate, between orders to be free, the old silence crept back in like cold air seeping through cracks in the marble. They called it liberation, but the chains were merely set aside for cleaning. Freedom arrived with the mechanical precision of Roman engineering. At dawn on the 17th of December, bronze bells rang across the 7 hills, their sound slicing through the morning mist, signaling the beginning of the Great Inversion. The transformation was governed by schedules more rigid than military campaigns, and the rules were embedded in muscle memory before they were even conscious thoughts. Slaves could mock their masters, but only between sunrise and sunset, only in certain spaces, only with words approved for complaint. They could speak truths that on any other day would mean death by crucifixion, but only if those truths served the celebration, only if they were pre-approved by centuries of tradition. The shift was as precise as clockwork, unsettling like a surgical incision. Masters who had spent their lives commanding now folded their spines into submissive postures, though their eyes remained hawk-like, cataloguing every gesture from their temporary equals. Every word from a slave's mouth was meticulously noted like a scribe recording inventory. Even their submission became a form of surveillance. In the kitchens, heavy with the smoke of roasting boar slaves discovered that giving orders was no easy task. It required muscles they didn't have. Their commands came out as whispered suggestions, their demands softened by vocal cords trained to speak only when spoken to. 20 years of silence had carved deep grooves in their throats, and authority could not fill them. They could ask for wine, food, entertainment, or revenge, but each request came wrapped in apologies, each rebellion carefully packaged as polite recommendation. The genius of the festival lay not in its chaos, but in its structure. The morning brought specific permissions at exact hours. Noon unlocked particular privileges. Evening returned restrictions all as reliably as the tides. Even revolution had its schedule, its limits, its containment within the precision of Roman administration. At sunset, without fanfare, the permissions would expire abruptly, as though snuffed out by an invisible hand, like candles extinguished by a sudden gust of wind. After 20 years of looking at stone floors, the slaves' neck muscles had atrophied into permanent downward curves. After 2 decades of speaking only when commanded, their throats had tightened around words like fists clutching coins. The slaves of Rome were prisoners not just of law or tradition, but of flesh that had adapted too thoroughly to the demands of survival under absolute power. In villa gardens, where roses bloomed beside marble statues of gods who had never known chains, elderly slaves tried to sit in their masters' chairs and found their spines fossilized into question marks, each vertebra shaped by years of anticipating blows from any direction, blows that could come for reaching for food without permission. Their hands moved with the hesitant flutter of birds nearing a trap they could not see but instinctively knew was there. Fingers once broken for touching forbidden objects now trembled as they lifted golden cups and ivory spoons. Freedom tasted like nausea, for the body had long forgotten how to digest abundance. Children born into bondage faced their own confusion. They watched the festivities with the wide-eyed stare of those witnessing magic in a language they had never learned. What was freedom to minds that had never seen its shape? What was choice to those who had only known the relief of having decisions made for them? They observed their elders struggling with simple choices: which cup to drink, from which chair to claim, which words to speak, and learned that liberty was not an instinct but a skill that could be lost, like the ability to walk after months in chains. The young ones learned by watching but what they witnessed it was not liberation. It was the spectacle of adults struggling to remember how to be human. They saw grown men and women falter over basic decisions, and in those moments they realized that freedom was not a reflex. It was something that could be forgotten, like a language left unused, until its grammar became foreign. The most painful moment came when the burden of temporary equality felt too heavy to bear. Deciding what to eat, where to sit, how to speak, when to rest, these simple acts of autonomy drained them like forced marches under the scorching Mediterranean sun. Some slaves retreated to kitchens and quarters, overwhelmed by the weight of possibility. Others grew paralyzed, standing motionless in doorways caught between the world they had always known and the one they were allowed to inhabit for this brief time. In those moments when temporary equality felt too burdensome to bear, and the simple act of being human exhausted them, the festival revealed its brutal truth. The most effective chains were not those forged by blacksmiths, but those grown in the body itself, cell by cell, breath by breath, until submission became as natural as the beating of the heart. The same amphitheatre where slaves had once watched their fellow bondsmen torn apart by lions now hosted a different spectacle. Wooden stages hastily erected in villa gardens saw slaves performing comedies that mocked their masters' vanities, cruelties, and absurd pretensions to divinity. The audience masters, their families, and guests roared with laughter at exaggerated portrayals of their own brutality. They applauded when actors portraying them were shown as bumbling tyrants stumbling over their own authority. They cheered when slave performers delivered speeches about the arbitrary nature of power and the randomness of birth, which placed some in silk and others in chains. They howled with delight when their own words, casual threats of crucifixion, offhand orders for floggings, bored commands to sell children away from their parents were repeated back to them in comic verse. The laughter was genuine, the entertainment real, but each gag carried a message as clear as words carved in stone. None of it mattered beyond the boundaries of festival time. The very complaints that could spark rebellion on any other day were now transformed into harmless theatre during Saturnalia. The anger that might fuel an uprising was channeled into performance art that strengthened rather than threatened the bonds between owner and property. Here lay the true masterpiece of Jamin social engineering, more sophisticated than their roads, more durable than their aqueducts, more effective than their legions. The energy that slaves might have used for real resistance was redirected into elaborate parodies that not only left the power structure intact, but reinforced it. Every joke about tyranny was also a demonstration of its permanence. Every mocked cruelty was an acknowledgement that cruelty would continue long after the festival's artificial boundaries had passed. The staging itself encoded a deeper truth about Roman power. Slaves performed on raised platforms while masters watched from below, but these platforms were temporary structures that could be dismantled between acts. The inversion was nothing more than an architectural sleight of hand. The visual theatre created the illusion of elevation while maintaining all the mechanisms of control. For the duration of their performances, the slaves stood higher than their masters, but only on platforms their masters had built. Speaking lines their masters had approved, and performing rebellion their masters had scheduled. The theatre ended when the powerful decided it ended. Even the slave actors' bows at the end of each show held a grim truth. They bent low before an audience that owned not just their bodies, but their resistance, not just their labour, but their very capacity for defiance. In the flickering torchlight as painted slaves delivered practice speeches about freedom, the real revolution died in laughter every night. The platforms were dismantled at the end of each performance and rebuilt every morning for the next show. The rebellion was portable, scheduled, and entirely under control. The audience never changed. Only the actors believed they had the power. The bronze bells that had announced liberation now rang to signal its execution. No trumpet fanfare accompanied the transition. No ceremony marked the boundary between freedom and bondage. At dawn on the 25th of December, when the winter sun crept over the Palatine Hill like a reluctant witness, the festival simply ended. It wasn't through negotiation or gradual withdrawal, but with the absolute finality of breath leaving a corpse. The transformation was executed with mechanical precision, as though crafted by Rome's finest engineers. Voices that had grown strong over 7 days of temporary authority shrank back to whispers so automatic that the vocal cords seemed to contract without conscious command. Spines that had straightened during moments of permitted dignity curved again into familiar arcs of deference vertebrae, falling into apologetic positions as naturally as stones settling into foundations. Hands that had grown comfortable with luxury returned to positions of submission, palms open, fingers loose, ready to receive orders or blows with equal acceptance. In kitchens where the smell of last night's feast still lingered in the air, heavy with olive oil and wine-soaked bread, slaves who had spent a week giving orders now waited for commands with the patience of those who had never questioned the source of their next breath. The temporary masters became servants again without resistance, without complaint, without even the shadow of disappointment crossing faces that had learned to express nothing that might be interpreted as discontent. The efficiency of the return was perhaps more disturbing than the festival itself. Bodies that had tasted freedom, adapted back to bondage as easily as changing clothes, as naturally as water flowing downhill toward the sea. The muscle memory of submission reasserted itself like an old injury responding to changes in the weather, automatic, inevitable, and somehow comforting in its familiarity. The psychological reset was equally complete, equally efficient. Conversations that had flowed freely between master and slave during Saturnalia simply stopped as if the ability to speak across the social divide had been a temporary illness that had finally broken its fever. Eye contact, which had been permitted and even encouraged during the festival, became impossible again, not forbidden by new commands, but simply unthinkable, like trying to breathe underwater or walk through solid stone. The very notion that these interactions had ever taken place began to feel like memories borrowed from someone else's life. Had they really sat in their masters' chairs? Had they really given orders to people who owned them? Had they truly tasted food meant for free mouths, slept in beds designed for human bodies rather than property? These experiences felt distant like childhood dreams, insubstantial as morning mist rising from the Tiber. Most unsettling was the sense of relief that accompanied the return. Not the bitter relief of prisoners whose tortures finally ended, but the genuine comfort of those returning home after an exhausting journey to a foreign land where they had never learned to speak the language properly. For many slaves, the weight of decision-making had been more crushing than the weight of chains. The responsibility of choice had required energy that survival had never permitted them to develop. Freedom, they discovered, was work. Bondage was ease. At least the labor was familiar work their bodies and minds had been trained to perform efficiently. Masters, too, settled back into their roles with visible satisfaction, manifested in relaxed shoulders and easier breathing. The experiment in temporary humanity had been entertaining, even intriguing, but normal service had resumed. Orders could flow once again in their proper directions without the awkwardness of recent equality. Punishments could be administered without the complicated memory of shared laughter. The natural order, the Roman order, the only order that made sense in a world built from conquest and maintained through control, reasserted itself with the certainty of the sun rising after an eclipse. In the weeks following Saturnalia, something extraordinary happened. In the villas and workshops scattered across Rome's 7 hills, slaves began to express gratitude, not the forced appreciation born of whips and brands, not the calculated submission that prevented worse punishments, but genuine thankfulness for their brief elevation to the ranks of humanity. They spoke of the festival as a gift in voices free from irony or hidden resentment. They thanked their masters for the privilege of 7 days as humans, with the same earnestness that free citizens reserve for thanking the gods for good harvests or successful military campaigns. The appreciation lived in their eyes when they recalled moments of permitted dignity, the taste of wine that had never touched a slave's lips, the feel of silk that had never warmed a slave's skin, the sound of their own voices, speaking words that carried weight rather than simply noise. It manifested in their behavior an increased loyalty that went beyond mechanical obedience, beyond broken spirits. They worked harder than before the festival, but their labor carried a different quality. It had the eager efficiency of people who felt they owed a debt to the world rather than the desperate productivity of those who feared the lash. They complained less, resisted less, plotted escape less frequently. When they spoke of their masters to other slaves, their words contained something that sounded disturbingly like affection. This was not manipulation in the crude sense of threats and rewards, nor was it the temporary suppression of rebellion through exhaustion or terror. This was social engineering on a level that reached the soul, a form of architecture that reconstructed the inner landscape of human consciousness itself. By offering slaves a taste of what they had lost, Rome had made them accomplices in their own subjugation. By giving them something to lose, it had given them something to be grateful for. By making freedom conditional, it had made slavery feel voluntary. The slaves who had experienced Saturnalia worked with different rhythms than those who had not. Their movements carried a subtle satisfaction as if they were participating in something larger than their individual suffering. They had been trusted with temporary authority. They had been included in the social mechanism, even if only as movable parts. They belonged to something greater than their own pain. They belonged to Rome itself, the greatest civilization the world had ever known. Children who witnessed the festival learned lessons no philosophy teacher could provide. They absorbed the understanding that freedom was not a right inherent in being human, but a privilege granted or withdrawn by those with the wisdom and power to make such decisions. They grew up knowing that liberty was something given and taken away, not something that existed in their bodies like blood or breath. The most successful slaves began to see themselves as partners in the Roman system, rather than victims of it. They had been chosen for special treatment. They had been deemed worthy of trust. They had been permitted to glimpse the machinery of power from the inside, to understand how decisions were made, how order was maintained, how civilization functioned. This knowledge made them valuable, made them special, made them different from the ordinary property that never received such education. When they looked at newly purchased slaves fresh from the market, still carrying the wild desperation of people, they saw them not as fellow sufferers, but as raw material, unformed, unpolished, yet to be shaped into something useful for Rome, who had not yet learned to accept their circumstances. The veterans of Saturnalia felt something that might have been pity, or might have been superiority. They knew something these newcomers did not. Resistance was pointless because the system was just. The festival had proven it. Masters who granted freedom even temporarily could not be tyrants. Owners who shared their luxury even briefly could not be monsters. The psychological alchemy was complete. Temporary freedom had made permanent bondage feel not just tolerable but reasonable, not just survivable but fair. Rome had solved the ancient problem of human bondage, how to own people without them hating you for it. Other civilizations had tried brutality. The Spartans had created helots who lived in permanent terror. The Egyptians had worked slaves to death building monuments to vanity. The Greeks had treated human property as talking tools that required constant supervision. Rome tried something different. Rome tried hope. The festival of Saturnalia was not an accident of tradition or a relic of earlier customs inherited from conquered peoples. It was a deliberately engineered social technology, as carefully designed as Roman roads that connected every corner of the empire, or Roman aqueducts that carried mountain water to desert cities. It served a specific function in the machinery of conquest and control to prevent rebellion, by providing the illusion of justice to maintain slavery, by offering controlled tastes of freedom to make oppression bearable, by making it seem temporary and voluntary. The genius was mathematical in its precision, as calculated as the angles of archstones that supported amphitheatre domes. 7 days of reversal per year created exactly enough pressure release to prevent explosive resistance, but not enough sustained change to threaten the fundamental architecture of power. The timing was perfect, long enough to feel real and meaningful, short enough to remain manageable and contained. The frequency was optimal, annual enough to provide hope and sustain morale, rare enough to maintain its special status and prevent expectations of regular equality. Other societies watched Rome's success and learned to copy its innovations. The model spread beyond the empire's borders, adapted to local customs and traditions, but retaining its essential function as a safety valve for social pressure. Controlled rebellion became a tool of governance exported like Roman wine or Roman coins. Managed revolution became a method of maintaining order, proving more effective than armies or walls. The permission to resist, when properly regulated and contained within acceptable boundaries, became more powerful than the prohibition of resistance. The psychological architecture was flawless in its understanding of human nature. Slaves who experienced temporary freedom became more invested in the system that provided it than those who had only known oppression. They had something to lose beyond their lives. They had memories of dignity, tastes of pleasure, moments of agency that could be withdrawn if they proved unworthy of such gifts. They had something to hope for beyond death, not escape or revolution, but the annual return of their temporary humanity. They had been given reasons to wait rather than reasons to fight. Even the masters benefited, though perhaps they did not fully understand it at a conscious level. By occasionally serving their slaves, by temporarily surrendering their authority, by briefly inhabiting the position of the powerless, they were able to maintain the fiction that their position was earned rather than inherited. They could point to Saturnalia as evidence of their benevolence, their wisdom, their sophisticated understanding of justice and human nature. They had created a system that made them feel virtuous, while they participated in the systematic dehumanization of others. The festival allowed them to experience mercy without ending in justice, to practice humility without surrendering power, to demonstrate their humanity without recognizing the humanity of those they owned. It was charity that cost nothing, generosity that maintained wealth, justice that preserved injustice. Most cunningly, it made the masters feel that they were better people than rulers who never granted such privileges, that they were enlightened rather than simply more sophisticated in their methods of control. Standing in these ruins now, where the winter wind moves through empty archways that once echoed with the laughter of the temporarily free-looking at stones that absorb the sweat, tears, and blood of both masters and slaves, the question becomes unavoidable and terrible. Would we have been different? Would we have seen through the architecture of managed liberation? Would we have recognized the festival for what it was? A machine that transformed hope into chains, rebellion into performance freedom, into a more elegant form of bondage? Or would we too have been grateful for our 7 days of permitted humanity? Would we too have learned to love the system that occasionally allowed us to remember what we had lost? Would we too have become willing participants in our own subjugation, partners in our own oppression, grateful slaves who thanked our masters for the privilege of temporary existence as human beings rather than property? The amphitheatres are empty now. Their stone seats, worn smooth by centuries of rain, have washed away the scent of blood wine and fear. Grass grows between marble blocks that once supported the weight of crowds watching slaves mock their masters in performances that everyone understood would end at sunrise. The villas have crumbled into romantic ruins where tourists take photographs beside broken columns documenting beauty without understanding the mechanism that created it. But the rhythm of Saturnalia persists, echoing through centuries with the persistence of water-wearing channels through stone. The innovation that Rome perfected, using freedom as a tool of control, hope as a method of management, temporary liberation as a technique for permanent subjugation, has been refined rather than abandoned. It operates now with such sophistication that it no longer requires festivals or formal inversions. It no longer needs the crude theatre of masters serving slaves. Look for it in the architecture of modern systems, the designated spaces for complaint that channel dissent into harmless directions. The scheduled times for resistance that ensure rebellion arrives only when power is prepared to contain it. The permitted channels for opposition that guide rage away from the machinery that creates it. The safety valves that release pressure without threatening the engines that generate it. The illusions of choice that make powerlessness feel chosen rather than imposed. The festivals of inversion continue, though they wear different costumes now. The brief moments when the powerless are permitted to speak truth to power, when the exploited are allowed to mock their exploiters, when the controlled are given temporary access to the language of control, these moments serve the same function they served in Roman villas. They make the system feel responsive, just capable of self-correction. They prove that those who rule are enlightened enough to laugh at themselves, sophisticated enough to permit criticism, wise enough to manage their own power responsibly. The psychological architecture has evolved but not changed. The controlled taste of agency that makes permanent powerlessness bearable. The scheduled moments of dignity that make routine humiliation tolerable. The occasional access to luxury that makes perpetual scarcity feel reasonable. The temporary permission to speak that makes enforced silence seem voluntary. The brief experiences of equality that make structural inequality feel natural. Even the gratitude remains, though it speaks different languages now. The appreciation for crumbs that prevents demands for bread. The thankfulness for small reforms that forestalls calls for transformation. The relief at minor concessions that makes major injustices seem survivable. the loyalty that grows from being allowed to glimpse what lies beyond the boundaries of permitted existence. The innovation of using hope as a chain has become so sophisticated that it no longer requires the crude theatre of role reversal. The system has learned to make people grateful for their limitations by occasionally showing them their alternatives. It has mastered the art of making bondage feel chosen by providing controlled experiences of choice. It has perfected the technique of making oppression seem voluntary by offering carefully managed moments of power. In the end, Saturnalia's lasting gift to human civilization was not the temporary liberation of Roman slaves, but the permanent enslavement of hope itself. Rome discovered that the most effective chains were not made of iron, but of possibility. The possibility that things could change if one waited long enough, that justice could be achieved if one worked within the system, that freedom could be earned through patience, proper behavior, and gratitude for small mercies. The slaves who experienced Saturnalia died in bondage, but they died believing their suffering had meaning. They died convinced that their patience had purpose, that their submission was a choice rather than a condition imposed by force. They died feeling they had been partners in something greater than their individual pain citizens, however temporarily of the greatest civilization the world had ever known. The stones remember nothing. They absorb rain, heat, and cold with equal indifference. Their surfaces are worn smooth by weather that cares nothing for the human stories played out against their hardness. The wind carries no voices from the past, no echoes of laughter or screams, nor the subtle sound of chains being polished for special occasions. But the pattern persists, as reliable as the seasons, as predictable as sunrise, as enduring as the roads and aqueducts that outlasted the empire that built them. Somewhere in some form the festival continues. Temporary freedom still serves permanent control. Hope still functions as the most elegant of cages. Permission still shapes the boundaries of resistance. The performance never ends, only the stage changes. Only the costumes are updated. Only the language adapts to new centuries. But the essential rhythm remains. The brief taste of what has been lost, the grateful return to what has been accepted, the deep satisfaction of belonging to something larger than individual suffering. The audience never changes seats. Only the actors believe they have been promoted. Thank you everyone for watching the whole video. Please like and subscribe to watch more good videos.